serious people who inherited a lot of money. What are your horror stories from people begging for your money? I won around £5,000 on a soccer accumulator a few years ago. Not a lot really, but a lot for a 23-year-old. To cut a long story short, because I didn't pay off my father's credit card debt with it, he fell out with me and pretty much tried to ruin my life. He told my then partner I had a gambling problem. I didn't, unless spending £5 a week on football constitutes a problem. Got my mother to call my work to tell them I had a problem, which resulted in work getting a fucking counselor in to talk to me, and basically preyed on my family's love for me by making them all make me feel horrendously guilty for ever placing a bet in the first place. It all reached a head when I came home to my partner in tears and my mother and father sat comforting her on the sofa, proceeding to tell me if she didn't know if she could trust me, and why couldn't I just admit how long I'd been gambling for. I physically removed my father from my house that night and told him to never darken my doorstep again. All over $5,000. Parents are sometimes toxic and an awful influence on your life. I cut him out because of it, which sadly has meant my relationship with my mother has taken a hit, but it was honestly the best thing I ever did. Don't be afraid of doing so if they add nothing but negativity to your life. My grandpa was pretty well off, and he suddenly died of undiagnosed prostate cancer a decade or so ago. The kids from his second marriage immediately swooped in and started claiming everything as theirs, despite us being just as close to him as they were. It ended with a lawsuit and the family being split in half, with us not regarding them as family anymore. We ended up getting basically nothing, and I'm frankly not impressed with how it was handled by either side. It's really sad seeing people you've known your whole life acting like that and ruining decades of being family in a couple weeks. On throwaway so I'm not outed. A few years ago a family member was killed. My parents secretly sued the person/company responsible, and we were awarded millions in a settlement. To this day I haven't shared this info with anyone because it's very personal. We don't want anyone to think we profited from their death, because that wasn't our intention. We wanted to make sure the spouse was cared for financially. After about 2 years of my parents being involved in court, the settlement was finalized. During this time, my sibling's spouse was cared for emotionally and financially by my family. After the case was settled, the spouse was awarded several million as one of the stipulations my parents set. Immediately after, they disappeared from our lives entirely. It was extremely disappointing to my family when that happened, especially considering all we had been doing to keep them going. Imagine having a son or daughter suddenly die and having to fight lawyers for years to give their spouse a happy life, only to have them take the money and run once it was all finished. Yes, my family did receive a rather large sum, and we had a dinner on his birthday to which this news was shared with all the siblings. It was a shock learning why the spouse had completely cut us off, and that I'd suddenly become rich as a result of everything. It feels wrong and slightly embarrassing, but I'm sure my sibling would be proud that they could help the family after their death. Still, I'll never tell anyone what happened, because I don't want my sibling's life story tarnished any further. I think everyone in my family feels the same. Nothing has changed in our lives afterward. At first I felt extremely guilty spending a dime of that money, but over time I've learned to appreciate the opportunities that it has given me. All of us have continued down the same path as before, although my parents have been traveling a lot, and I don't blame them one bit. Family coming out of the woodwork threatening to sue for the money. Family have surprise visits and looked like they thought I hid the money in the house somewhere. No amount of telling them we inherited less than $500 would make them go away. They did not believe it. Now they all just hate us, and I no longer get invited to family outings. I'm dealing with this shit right now. My great aunt and godmother was a lesbian. Her partner, my auntie Kitty, had been with her since the 1950s. When my godmother moved to New York, Auntie Kitty was disowned by her family when it came out she was with a woman. My godmother died when I was 12 and left my auntie Kitty everything in her will, which made things strained with my dad's family, though my dad and one of his brothers still talked to her. I moved to New York at 18 for school, and, knowing no one else in the city, we became close. She was thrilled that I wanted to have a relationship with her and spend time with her, and didn't hesitate to think of her as my aunt, even though she technically wasn't. She was legit the greatest, and we spent holidays together, and she would come to things I worked on, and I knew all her friends and she knew mine. I basically spent a decade with her, being like another grandmother to me. She died a few months ago, and it sucks. I miss her a lot, to put it lightly, but she was in her 90s and lived a long life. Thing was, she left everything to me. Now, I knew she had money, it was hard to miss, but I didn't know how much money she had. I ended up with a decent sized amount of cash and investments, a brownstone in the city, and a place in on the beach in the Carolinas. Her family came out of the woodwork when she died, sniffing around for money and demanding I give them the beach house, or cash, or whatever. Her will states explicitly that they are not to receive anything from her estate, and it's all to go to me, but they are threatening to sue, since they are sure she wanted to give them something, even though she hadn't talked to any of them in over half a century, and in some cases, had never met them. On the opposite side of things, my dad's sisters and brothers are pissed they didn't get anything, because they'd occasionally sent her a Christmas card. None of them view it as fair that I was given everything when they were given nothing. None of them showed up to her funeral. None of them had properly seen her or talked to her in years except my dad. One of my aunts has gone so far as harassing my boyfriend, since he's apparently only in it for the money, despite the fact that he had a better relationship with her than she did and had to help me plan her funeral. It's basically a shit show, and I hate it. When my grandmother died, she left money to pay for my entire college education, including graduate school. At the time, it seemed that all my friends needed money. So, to be true to my grandmother's wishes, I said nothing about the inheritance and paid for those college years as she intended. If I had done otherwise, they would beg me for money for a variety of needs. I was lucky enough to have very successful grandparents. I'm also lucky enough to still have all of my grandparents at the age of 31. They are all over 82. The grandfather of importance to this conversation only has an 8th grade education, but he built a strong business, water well drilling. When each of his 7 grandchildren were born, he deposited $87K, the year I was born. I assume that's the same for the others, into a managed trust. We don't make a habit of discussing money, but there are a few requirements. Namely, I won't have complete control over it until I'm 50. I get a statement every fall, and I knew my retirement is taken care of. What happened when I told my spouse? We dated for 3 years, been together 8, and it was close to 3 years before I even mentioned it. Aside from my spouse, it's no one's business. Why on earth would I tell people of my impending windfall? Be smart, people. Keep your bank accounts out of conversation. My grandmother had an education fund made for me and put money in it every month. I was pretty young and my mom was poor and wanted to use that money to buy pot and cigarettes and other stuff. She kept bugging me and bribing me with stuff. I told my grandmother, who made sure my mom couldn't access the account. I inherited a fair amount of money. When my grandfather passed away, my husband and I were planning on using it to purchase our first house. We had been saving, but clearly could have a much lower mortgage with this windfall. Well, my husband works a side business where he builds custom vehicles. One friend who was running out of money and his car was only about halfway done found about the inheritance only because we stupidly asked his advice on mortgage options and decided he was going to pull his car because he didn't have the funds to finish it and then sue us for $10,000. And unfortunately, we got a lawyer and ended up spending over $3,500 to have him say that the customer usually is right and we'd be further ahead to just settle and pay him because the lawyer fees would be much more if we continued to fight. Breaks my heart to this day that a good chunk of my inheritance went to pay that dick bag off so he could take his vehicle somewhere else to get it finished. I had most of my college paid for through scholarships and a fund my parents set up when I was a baby. My roommate junior year would always bring this up as an excuse to not pay for things. Example, well, you have a college fund, so you should pay for my dinner too. I have to take out loans, so you should pay for my rent this month. I ended up moving out and avoided her for the rest of my time at school.